Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Social Sciences, SOSS. Postgraduate Diploma in Disaster Management, PGDDM. MPA-003 Risk Assessment and Vulnerability Analysis. Unit-11 Vulnerability to Shanty Settlements, 11.0 Learning Outcome. After reading this unit, you should be able to understand the problems relating to urbanization, analyze the specific problems and requirements of slums, and suggest ameliorative measures. 11.1 Introduction. The National Commission on Urbanization defines urbanization as a process whereby the surplus population of workers from rural areas resettles in urban centers where non-agricultural job opportunities are available. If job opportunities are productive and led to gainful employment, urbanization becomes a catalyst for economic development. If urbanization is merely a process of transfer of rural poverty to an urban environment, it results in concentration of misery. Economic Survey of Delhi. 2000. 11.1.1 Levels of urbanization. As against 23 large cities in India with a population of 70.7 million and above, it has been revealed by the 2001 census that there are now 35 large cities accounting for over 107.9 million persons. The growth of population has put increased strain on urban infrastructure and services, as highlighted in the 10th Plan Mid-Term Review document. About 21% of the urban population is living in squatter settlements, where access to basic services is extremely poor. Although 89% of the urban population is reported to have access to safe drinking water, there are severe deficiencies with regard to equitable distribution of water. Nearly 46% of urban households have water toilet, but only 36% of the urban households are connected to the public sewerage system. Average per capita generation of waste is estimated at 0.4 kilograms per capita per day in cities ranging from 1 lakh to 50 lakh population, and the garbage collection efficiency ranges between 50 to 90% of the solid waste generated. City roads are inadequate for traffic requirements, leading to congestion and fast deterioration in the quality of roads due to excess loads. 10th Plan Mid-Term Review. Report. 11.1.2 Urbanization and Economic Growth. This has significant developmental implications in that urban areas are the engines of productivity and growth in the country. This is manifest in the increasing contribution of urban sector to national income. In 1951, the contribution of urban India to net state domestic product was 29%, which grew to 37% in 1971 and has reached 60% in 2001. As far as the correlation between the urbanization and rise in per capita income is concerned, there is unanimity among scholars that correlation is positive. Hence the well-being of urban areas is important, as they contribute nearly 55% of the GDP of India, and this share is expected to rise further in the coming years. 11.1.3 The Urban Crisis. It is evident thus that the positive role of urbanization has often been overshadowed by the deterioration in the physical environment and quality of life in the urban areas caused by the widening gap between demand and supply of essential services and infrastructure. Imperfections in the land and housing markets and exorbitant increases in land prices and rates have virtually left the urban poor with no alternative but to seek informal solutions to their housing problems, leading to the growth of crowded settlements which degenerate into slums. Urban slums are a melting pot of people belonging to varied socio-cultural backgrounds. When combined with dismal economic condition, these can easily become a source of cultural ferment and communal frenzy. The urban ecosystem is in crisis, which is expected to increase in geometric proportion as urbanization accelerates and the availability of financial resources for urban development decline. If the present trend continues, about half of the humanity will be living in cities by the end of this century. In the more fully industrialized countries, the proportions have been higher than that for many decades. In the 1990s, largest, often the most rapid rates of city growth have been in countries with predominantly agriculturist and rural populations. Equally striking is the enormous spread and density of populated areas throughout the industrialized world. There has been Marked proliferation of tall buildings for business and housing. Suburban and ex-urban growths have greatly expanded the built-up areas and the scope of urbanized activity in wealthier countries or city. As per a publication of United Nations, Prospects of World Urbanization, 1988, Asia, which forms about 41% of the world's urban population in 1990. Asia's rate of growth of urban population is second only to Africa's 3.2% per annum in 1985. 90 compared to as high as 5.2% in African countries. Even within Asia, countries have been divided into 4 regions: Eastern Asia, Southeastern Asia, Southern Asia, and Western Asia, with average annual urban growth rates varying from 1.9% in Eastern Asia to 43% in Southern Asia in 1985-90 p.c. Talwar. 3 of the most vulnerable Indian cities in the world are Mumbai, Delhi and Calcutta. More people enter the city limits of Mumbai, 1,140, per day than any other city in the world, where the growth rate of 4.2 is exceeded only by Karachi with a rate of 4.9%. A major proportion of the population in the 3 cities live in informal settlements with enhanced risks of health hazards, fire, flood, earthquake, road accidents and evictions. Davis, 2000. Extreme densities in these populations compound all the dangers. For example, 60% of Kolkata's population of 6.4 million live in squatter settlements where the density peaks at 32,000 people per square kilometer, forming one of the highest urban concentrations in the world. The physical environment of the slums, characterized by restricted living space and noise, are at their worst, and so are the changes in the social organization. Slum dwellers live on the fringes of society. The lifestyles get unhealthy with high incidences of alcoholism, health problems and criminal propensity. Most underworld activities have been found to originate in the slums. The sociology of slums is as much an issue as is its physical environment. Child development is an issue of concern in slums. There is need to provide healthy physical and social environment for children living in slums. Issues like gender assume critical significance in the above context. As borne out by statistics, there is less emphasis on education of the girl child in step with the nationwide trend. Refer Table 3. Perception of a health hazard, particularly urban-based hazards, should form an important element in the modern world. Both the Yokohama Strategy, at the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction (IDNDR) Midterm Conference in 1984, and the Habitat Global Forum's Plan of Action for Safer World that emerged from the 1996 City Summit in Istanbul have noted the challenge to reduce urban risks. The Habitat Plan of Action has also spoken of the basic unnaturalness of urban disasters. 11.1.4 Proliferation of shanty towns. Urban slums are commonly referred as shanty towns. Shanty towns are also called favelas, Brazil, or bastis, India. 3 main features of shanty towns are: 1. Houses are made from scrap materials such as wood and metal sheeting. 2. Often housing does not have services such as sanitation, water or electricity. And 3. The settlements are usually overcrowded. As brought out in the 10th 5-year plan midterm review document, nearly 28 million persons lived in slums in 1981, accounting for 17.5% of the urban population. In 1991, the number of persons living in slums increased to 45.7 million, accounting for 21.5% of urban population. According to the Town and Country Planning Organization, TCPO estimates 2001, the slum population number is 61.82 million. Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka and West Bengal report the highest number of towns with slum population. Refer Annexure 1. Some of the cities reporting highest slum population as Greater Mumbai have a total slum population of 11,914,398, Delhi Municipal Corporation 9,817,439, Kolkata 4,580,544, Bangalore 4,292,223, and Chennai 4,216,268, among others, refer Annexure 2. Table 1, 2 and 3 attached as appendices give the total urban slums population and number of clusters in different states. As far as physical environment is concerned, the National Sample Survey Organization NSSO in the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, Government of India, Annexure I and II, has released the report of a nationwide survey carried out by it during July 2002 to December 2002 on the condition of urban slums. For the purpose of the survey, a slum was defined as a compact settlement with a collection of poorly built tenements, mostly of temporary nature, crowded together usually with inadequate sanitary and drinking water facilities in unhygienic conditions. Such an area was considered as non-notified slum if at least 20 households lived in that area. Areas notified as slums by the respective municipalities, corporations, local bodies or development authorities were treated as notified slums. For the survey, slums in urban areas only were considered. At the All India level, 3,538 urban blocks selected scientifically through a sampling technique formulated by a group of experts consisting of academicians, researchers and senior government statisticians were surveyed, and 692 slums in all were found in the surveyed urban blocks. The purpose of the survey was to examine the living conditions in these slums with respect to infrastructure, that is roads, sanitation, electricity, water supply etc. It is estimated from this survey that about 52,000 slums were located in the urban areas of the country and about 8 million urban households lived in these slums. This represented as high as 14% of the total urban households in the country. The number of slums was highest in Maharashtra, 32%, followed by West Bengal, 16%, and Andhra Pradesh, 15%. Some of the findings of the above referred to survey in relation to the basic facilities are indicated below. On an average about 205 households lived in a notified slum and 112 lived in non-notified slums. A little more than half of the slums were notified by the respective municipalities, corporations, local bodies or development authorities, but they shared a relatively larger proportion, 65%, of slum households. The proportion of slum households living in notified slums was higher than the national average, 65%, in Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, and Karnataka. About 65% of the slums were built on public land owned mostly by local bodies, state governments, etc. Source: http mospi.nic.in/nsso_pr.htm. Urban shanty settlements and related risks, like urban fire, outbreak of epidemics and widespread poverty, are likely to increase manifold in the new millennium in India due to anticipated and unprecedented large-scale migration of rural people to limited urban areas. In 1980-81, 23% of India's total population used to live in urban areas, which increased to 23.73% in 1990-91. A trend analysis made by HUDCO projects that India's population will rise to 40% level during 2020-21. This concentration of population will generate much more economic activities in terms of industrialization and commercial activities, which are expected to put extra pressure of fire risks in urban areas due to mushrooming of high-rise buildings and formation of slum clusters, followed by scarcity of essential supplies of power, food, shelter, and particularly water. Congestion in these areas increases disaster vulnerability, especially to fires during summers and floods, if located in flood-prone areas. Disaster response faces serious infrastructural bottlenecks. These agglomerates are poorly housed. There is little free space, water or electricity, which makes relief and restoration work difficult. Shanty towns or slums are not an India-specific problem. Almost every country in the world faces the problem of migrations and overpopulated metropolises. Policy intervention in this case has to look at larger issues like studying the phenomenon of migrations and designing policy to mitigate it. This involves major town planning issues including generation of employment in small and medium towns, diversifying cropping in villages to prevent sell-outs in case of single crop failure, provision of educational facilities for youth for more employment avenues, vocational training, encouragement of self-employment ventures among youth in villages, small and medium towns, development of infrastructure in small and medium towns etc. As per PC Talwar, increasing commercialization of urban dwellings into shopping malls and other business activities is affecting the livelihood of urban poor in that machines are replacing human labor. 11.2 Vulnerability in the city. Vulnerability is usually very varied among the persons or activities of a city, but we can recognize certain common features of cities that create distinctive urban risks. If policy planners do not nip these into the bud by means of public safety measures, they set the stage for concentrated and complex disasters. In built-up areas, building safety often lies at the heart of vulnerability. This applies to property risks, which create dangers for people who spend most of their time in and around built structures. Densely populated neighborhoods and heavily occupied structures are concentrated in cities. Often destruction in one district or the collapse of one or two buildings may bring on a calamity. Modern industries and infrastructure have matched the growth of cities with increasing scales and concentration of energy or physical forces. Even more forms and quantities of dangerous substances are being manufactured in urban areas, stored in warehouses and even in people's kitchen cupboards or passing through on the highways and railroads. More and more varied techniques of violent environmental modification such as high explosives, biocides, heavy earth-moving and tunneling equipment are being used in the city. The range of such forces or their proximity to densely occupied areas magnifies the scope of dangers and the likelihood of technological disasters. 11.2.1 Technological disasters. Most technological disasters take place in urban centers. These are derived from large-scale transportation of people, goods and fuels converge upon and are more concentrated in cities, which are more likely to be prone to these disasters. An assessment of the 112 worst civilian or peacetime military air crashes from 1945 to 1990 show that 91 were in or close to urban centers, most often their airports, concentrated residential neighborhoods and commercial districts, and the industries and energy supplies of cities involve large amounts of inflammable materials. These can create exceptional risks of mass fires and have resulted in many disasters up till now. Industrial spills and accidents in the transporting of dangerous substances most often occur in and near urban centers. The worst chemical disaster till date involves the Union Carbide, India's Bhopal plant. Certain highly toxic and volatile chemicals accrued in the intermediate processes of pesticide manufacture, notably methyl isocyanide, MIC. 3 indirectly related developments set the stage for disaster in the night and early morning of the 3rd or the 4th of December, 1984. There was a major leak of MIC. Being heavier than air, the gas cloud moved down slope, spreading through the low-lying squatter camps over a radius of some 25 kilometers. Technology that is peculiarly threatening to public health. The built environment and natural habitats are often involved with or inspire dubious weapons which are destructive of human life. Nuclear technology has not been limited to separate military and peaceful endeavors. Both share the same sciences and laboratories, bureaucrats, technologies, mines and industries. Less widely appreciated is the role of peaceful industries in chemical and biological warfare. Technological risks are bound to be pervasive in an urban industrial society. According to Philip Wagner, technology has become our primary environment. One example is the way modern life is almost fully dependent on electricity and electrical devices as much as the air we breathe. After motorized transport, and sometimes before it, electrification is taken as a first definitive step in modernization. There is the possibility of contested health hazards of electromagnetic fields surrounding high voltage transmission and radiation. Hazards from electronic equipment in offices and households. There are the risks in electricity generation, thermal power, the dominant use of coal and the proliferation of Large hydroelectric dams are among the foremost technologies identified with large health and environmental risks. 11.2.2 Dangers of dependence. These arise partly from what is called metabolism of a city. The city life must rely upon a constant inflow of resources, information and goods, and outflow of products, information and waste. People are dependent upon built infrastructure for life support and economic productivity is especially at risk. But the city is also a mosaic of personal, societal, and economic dependencies. A majority of urban people without productive land or other private resources depends upon wage employment and forms of barter exchanges. Dependency in the sense also singles out the most vulnerable members of communities and families who from personal misfortune or lack of rights and opportunities have to depend on others. These and many others have to rely on social security measures, material aid, charity or emergency relief to survive personal accident or collective disasters. The numbers and the densities of persons or the frequency of exchange among them increases the potential for dangerous encounters. The stresses of crowded living can make persons who would otherwise be fairly robust more vulnerable to traffic accidents or the spread of infectious diseases. Congestion reduces options and restrains flexibility. 11.2.3 Environmental hazards and human settlements. The study of earth problems, particularly of urban human settlements, has been limited to the control of waste byproducts, that is, solid, liquid, and gaseous. It is also established that their byproducts, if uncontrolled, would lead to widespread disease. Only scanty attention has been paid to the health of the people at the level of rural settlements because of a number of practical problems. The problems associated with the urban settlements pertain to the inadequacy of water supply, waste disposal, unhygienic conditions of housing and of the residential neighborhoods, and industrial pollutions of the environment by noxious microbiological agents, land zoning, urban renewal, land use, subdivision, and vehicular traffic. Many countries and municipalities face serious health hazards because environmental health was given insufficient attention in planning. In a community with a local planning agency, health department participation can be a significant factor in community health conditions. Both the health officers and the planners are working towards the same goal, which is a better environment. There is growing epidemic research evidence to suggest that there is positive a great correlation between health and various aspects of urbanization, viz. Housing, work environments, transportation, overcrowding, residential densities, neighborhood planning, satellite and industrial townships planning, migration, quality of life, etc. It is now well recognized that most city dwellers live under various suboptimal or negative influences related to the urban environment. These include noise, air pollution, water pollution, problems of transportation, overcrowding, high prices of flood, and stresses associated with urban lifestyle. All the laboring urban poor are, however, not rural migrants. A substantial proportion of city population consists of people who may have descended from artisan, industrial, or service worker families from earlier migrant generations, or who might have been the residents of neighboring villages that have been encapsulated within the city limits by much earlier urban descendants of the original residents of the area, and the urban economy lived and thrived on the easy availability of this surplus labor forces. Their initial settlements, mostly in vacant lands or outskirts, are labeled slums, as discussed previously, which, during pre-election times, face vote-catching promises of housing-related services such as water, sanitation, etc., the health hazards of the poor, and therefore, directly related to firstly poverty, secondly, polluted and stressful urban environment, and thirdly, to social inability and insecurity. They are more vulnerable to communicable diseases and malnutrition as compared to villages, and at the same time are exposed to greater risk of accidents at their work on the roads and in their dwelling places. Simultaneously, health hazards associated with child labor, prostitution, alcohol and drug abuse etc. increase their mobility. Even in most underdeveloped rural areas, they do not experience such comparable extremes of health hazards. Moreover, ethnic heterogeneity and mobility need to compete in the immediacy of daily strife for survival, precipitate cultural and identity crises and increase their vulnerability to routine problems of life arising out of poor housing, inadequate water supply and bad sanitation. Seasonal flooding during the heavy wet spells of the monsoon is an annual occurrence in Bombay, causing traffic disruptions, house collapses and electrical short circuits. Although the high intensity of tropical monsoon rains is the primary cause of flooding, the contribution of Bombay's bowl-like topography and its situation on low-lying, at or just above sea level, land reclaimed from the sea is certainly a factor. For example, the repeated choking of the railways during the heavy rains may be attributed to the silting of the rail corridors along the keel of the elongated depressions. The man-made terrain of Bombay poses a severe challenge so far as the management of sewage and storm water drainage is concerned. A large part of the old city interior is on reclaimed ground at or near to sea level, which renders gravity flow of sewage into the sea almost impossible, in which case, pumping is invariably required. The drainage system is thoroughly unsatisfactory in as much as the level of the main drain is below the level of the low water spring high tide, characterized by rough seas and swell waves striking the shores. Not only is drainage outflow impossible, but it is also necessary to check the reversed inflow of the tidal waters into the land. Sewage surfacing in the industrial heart of the city, which lies in a low bowl, means that waterborne diseases like infectious hepatitis and enteric fever are endemic in the city. Thus, the worst sufferers are the slum dwellers living in the city center, vulnerable to risks posed by health, housing, swampy location and frequent fires. 11.2.4 Population displacement. In the last decade, issues related to natural disasters and development-induced population displacement and resettlement and rehabilitation of the affected populations have generated considerable debate. These issues are natural disasters, urbanization and industrialization, natural resource development, agricultural transformation and infrastructure expansion. We also have to differentiate between marginalization and displacement. Marginalization is an effect of displacement. From an ethical point of view, we have to consider cases of people being occupationally displaced because they have no alternative venues of employment. This type of displacement does not fit the framework of marginalization or the conventional meaning of displacement. Each set of guidelines express concern with the extent of displacement that can be caused by development projects. Generally, they call for minimizing displacement effects. In this regard, the best practices will involve finding ways to avoid all displacements without causing greater harm through blocking development opportunities for this in other communities. The concern here is that rather than impoverishing ousted populations in order to meet development needs of others, benefits of development must be available more evenly throughout communities. The best practices, accordingly, will include resettlement and rehabilitation as part of disaster management so as to advance the well-being of the displaced people no less than any other affected communities. There is also a concern that especially vulnerable social groups, including women, ethnic minorities, and landless people, have generally suffered more than others in displacements. The best practices with regard to these people would involve paying special attention to their needs by increasing their opportunities and reducing their relative impoverishment so as to reduce dependency and therefore vulnerability. 11.2.5 Pressure of rising population. The world's population is increasing. The number of people exposed to hazards is continually rising. Continued population growth outstrips the ability of governments to invest in education and other social support services, and increased competition for land resources. In the very poorest countries, exploitation of natural resources has created a problem of food shortage, which has increased the possibility of droughts. In developing countries where families survive only through supplying labor and the oldest members depend on support from the young, the pressure for large families persists. Conversely, the demographic trend in the developed countries is creating a rise in the elderly population who need specialized support in case of disasters. In developing countries, rural land pressure adds to the problems, perhaps as many as 850 million people live in areas suffering severe environmental degradation. In many underdeveloped countries, more than 80% of the population is dependent on agriculture, but many are denied equal access to land resources. Poverty forces the adoption of unsustainable land use practices in countries with a legacy of deforestation. Soil erosion and overcultivation find their environment more vulnerable to environmental hazard, especially floods and droughts. The modernization of agriculture can bring problems. In the tropics, large areas have been given over to capital-intensive plantation agriculture, often accompanied by reservoir construction for water supplies. This displaces farmers from their land and the controlled supply of irrigation water for the monocultural cash crops reduces the seasonal flooding necessary for flood retreat agriculture. Low-lying coasts have been made more vulnerable to storm surge by the clearance of mangrove forests, often for fish farming and salt production in the underdeveloped countries and for tourist development in the developed countries. Inland, the drainage of wetlands leads to loss of common property resources such as fisheries and forests. The impoverishment of the agricultural base results in large shifts of population from rural areas to urban areas. 11.2.6 Rural-urban migration. In the developed countries of the West, the rural to urban migration and the urbanization are associated with a vertical shift in the labor force from the agricultural sector to the urbanized industrial sector, whereas in the developing regions as India, migration is from rural agricultural sectors to urban informal sectors. Mukherjee, 2002, says that this is a typical manifestation of underdevelopment, poverty and spatial disorganization of economy, of underdeveloped sectors of the society, which arose partially as a result of past colonization and its adverse consequences on the economy. These displacements are not due to structural changes within the labor force as seen in the West, but as a dislocation of uprooted workers and peasants from the marginalized countryside to the urban centers. This displacement in India is a typical characteristic of urban growth that has outpaced industrialization. It is a system of underdevelopment, and it tends to compound further underdevelopment. Mukherjee, 2002. Large groups of landless, unskilled, uneducated, illiterate laborers and petty farmers leave their villages and go to distant large towns or cities like Bombay, Delhi and Madras. Their arrival causes undue stress to the urban system, which has now to deal with pavement dwelling, slums, squalors, disease, crime, and ultimate degeneration. The urban system breaks down often due to these stresses: water shortage, electricity, transportation, education, housing, security and other services fail. When migration into urban regions continues, ongoing and increasing demands are made on the local economy, which is anyways struggling for sustainability. This causes a major drain on the economy. In some cases, drains on public funds do not stop at local coffers but instead invade national revenue pools, thus forcing adjustments in national priorities. Of course, this last scenario, where it occurs, is not the only way in which national development potential can be impacted by the urban influx. Since metropolitan areas house the strengths of national economies, the efficiency of those economies is impeded by anything that impairs the efficiency of the city. Maki, 1994, 11.2.7 Housing problem. It is urban poor who bear the brunt of the housing crisis. The condition is no better than that documented by the Whitley Commission in 1930, that houses, many without plinths, windows and adequate ventilation, usually consist of single small room, the only opening being a doorway, often too low to enter without stooping, in order to secure some privacy. Old kerosene tins and gunny bags are used to form screens, which further restrict the entrance of light and air in dwellings such as these. Human beings are born, sleep, eat and die. According to a World Bank study, 2/3 of urban households of Madras and Ahmedabad cannot afford a house of 5,000 rupees, which is the cheapest that the modern building technology can build. Moreover, low-cost high-rise tenement housing for resettlement after slum eviction does not favor social and economic relationships which the urban poor creates while living in the slums. Resettlements of the urban poor in far-flung colonies. does not work since the poor tend to sell or desert or give on rent their lots of lands and come back into the city to seek employment opportunities. The scheme to improve the housing condition of 35 million slum dwellers is quite costly and difficult. 11.2.8 Water supply issues. The urban water supply and sanitation sector in the country is suffering from inadequate levels of service, increasing demand-supply gap, poor sanitary conditions and deteriorating financial and technical performance. According to Central Public Health Engineering Organization, CPHEEO, estimates, as on the 31st of March 2000, 88% of urban population had access to a potable water supply. Transmission and distribution networks are old and poorly maintained, and generally of poor quality. Consequently, water supply is slow and sluggish and water gets contaminated due to seepages. The situation is even worse in summer when water is available only for a few minutes, sometimes not at all. As per the observation made in the 10th plan, the principal reason for the persistence of these problems is that urban water supply and sanitation service providers are not financially viable. They have not been able to impose user charges because of political constraints and are in need of large subsidies to maintain quality of services. Two other problems pointed out are lack of autonomy and accountability, and sometimes managerial expertise with personnel involved. Planners accede to the fact that a shift to professionally managed, financially viable bodies would be a better option to secure better service delivery. Besides, environmental degradation has also been a problem. According to a World Bank study of the 27 Asian cities with populations of over 1 million, Chennai and Delhi are ranked as the worst performing metropolitan cities in terms of hours of water availability per day, while Mumbai is ranked as second worst performer and Calcutta fourth worst. SOSS, Background Paper, International Conference on New Perspectives on Water for Urban Rivers and Lakes. Chennai, for instance, has to bring in water from a distance of 200 kilometers. Whereas Bangalore gets its water from the Kaveri River, which is 95 kilometers away. Where surface water sources fail to meet the rising demand, groundwater reserves are being tapped, often to unsustainable levels. Management of urban solid waste is one of the unresolved dilemmas of development. In cities, nearly half the solid waste remains unattended. Lack of financial resources, inadequate manpower, fragmentation of administrative responsibility, non-involvement of community and lack of awareness have been identified as the main constraints in the 10th Five-Year Plan Mid-Term Review Report. These form some of the factors contributing to the vulnerability of cities, which could now be discussed in detail. 11.2.9 Sanitation. Urban India is a collection of stink chambers. Next to poverty, the most depressing feature of India is its ability to ignore the surrounding filth and unhygienic conditions. 1/3 of urban population does not have access to any type of latrines, which are hardly sanitary. The 6th plan claimed only 20% of sewerage coverage in 198 towns. In spite of the fact that sewerage system pollutes water sources and creates stinking mosquito breeding areas, planning still centers on these areas. The urbanization process results in land pressure as migrants from outside move into already overcrowded cities where the new arrivals have few alternatives other than to occupy unsafe land. But the risk from natural hazards are only a part of the dangers these communities face. There are often far greater and more pressing, normal, risks of malnutrition and poor health. Slum residents often incur greater risk from natural hazard as a result of having to live in very closely built structures, which can disturb natural land drainage patterns and water courses. The urbanization process not only magnifies the dangers of hazard events, it is in itself partly a consequence of a desperate migrant response to rural disasters. There is evidence from Delhi, Khartoum and Dhaka that the rural families who have become destitute as a result of drought or floods have moved to these cities in search of food and work. Current projection indicates that within the coming 10 years, there will be 22 cities with population in the 10 to 25 million ranges. Of these, 14 are in the third world, 11 in being hazardous zones. In all, 13 of the 22 are prone to major hazards. 1. Of the most disturbing facts is that these cities, no fewer than 7, are within high seismic risk zones. These cities contain large numbers of buildings of variable quality, many of them poorly constructed or badly maintained. The vast majority of deaths and injuries from earthquakes result from building collapses and ensuing damage. Urban population remains in crowded areas, with many residing in low-lying, flood-prone areas in flimsy housing and with a lack of adequate infrastructure. The millions who have caused these cities to swell into today's megacities are part of the patterns of development which has focused extractive, export-oriented economic activity established a century or more ago, referring to the Industrial Revolution and the definition of development in terms of the industrial ethos. Persistent urban poverty underlines the pattern of people's vulnerability. There are few examples of urban settlement on hillside prone to landslides like Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Guatemala City, La Paz, Brazil, and Caracas, Venezuela, and land prone to flooding or tidal inundation like Guayaquil, Ecuador, Recife, Brazil, Monrovia, Liberia, Lagos and Port Harcourt, Nigeria, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, Delhi, India, Bangkok, Thailand, Jakarta, Indonesia, and Dhaka, Bangladesh. These urban poor have declining connections with rural relatives with each passing generation, so the resources available to them for reconstruction of livelihoods after extreme storms are also very deteriorating. 11.3 Risk in urban areas. The dynamics of change in urban settlements because of large-scale migration has led to the evolution of high-rise structures, mixed land use, high population density and growth of cottage tank. These are instrumental in adding another dimension to loss patterns during disasters, and that is the risk of fire. The theft of power in illegal settlements is a potential threat. The earthquake in Turkey caused rippling of electric poles, collapse of large number of buildings, huge refinery fire, and blockage of roads, so much so that rescue teams, which flew from different places, struggled to reach victims buried under the collapsed structures. More than 10,000 died not by the earthquake but by the collapsed buildings. The situation would be no different in any developing country where earthquake strikes an urban area. The prevention of an earthquake is not possible, but the loss caused by the earthquake can be controlled through careful planning. The loss pattern can also be influenced by well-coordinated disaster management plans for the area. Derry, 2001. In urban areas, households are often characterized by a dependence upon the market, not only for employment and food, but also for other basic needs. Poverty and unemployment both in the rural as well as the urban areas has perpetrated a system of low wages and exploitation. Cheap labor is an indispensable element within the industrial organization in third world countries. All developing economies partly achieve in optimizing their production, reducing the cost by the availability of cheap labor with hardly any bargaining strength. This labor force, in the secondary and tertiary sectors of the urban economy and almost wholly administering the informal sector, is no doubt very supportive of the economic base of the towns, yet they are least important in the management of urban affairs. The cities need their services without any reciprocal commitment for their welfare. The exploitation is acute and obvious, particularly with the floating unemployed population looking for daily wages. The regular stream of people adds to the number of unemployed and underemployed. Unlimited growth of a city will end up in a disaster. This can be taken as an axiom. This is visible at once in a poor or developing country with very limited resources at its command. In a developed society, with enormous resources at its command, the state is able to prevent the chaotic situation emerging by intervention through huge public investments in perspective planning and readiness to invest in public utilities including infrastructure to meet the projected demands to create a semblance of order in affluent countries which are more in the nature of a working machine than an ideal human habitat. One of the most serious problems that the unlimited growth of individual towns faces is the problem of segmentation and the lack of cohesion and integration between the old and the new areas. Many of these relate form the core and periphery as the distance increases. Manifest changes in the two are in terms of the traditional and modern. Architecture, the infrastructure base now well integrated with the existing one. Throughout the 20th century, there has been a marked acceleration of processes of modernization and urbanization in developing societies. Cities in the Third World, and especially urban centers of Asia, have swollen with influx of migrants from the countryside. In many cases, failing rural economies and natural disasters has driven these migrants, but of equal importance is the allure of city life. Concomitantly, developing societies have been progressing through that transformation of patterns of morbidity and mortality known as the epidemiologic transition. Rates of infectious and parasitic disease have remained high, but rates of chronic disease and especially coronary heart disease, CHD, have climbed at an alarming rate. How are we to account for this transition? Conventional wisdom would argue that as modernization and urbanization proceed, life becomes more sedentary, and diets become more sodium and fat laden, which in turn increases blood pressure and unfavorable lipid profiles leading to coronary heart diseases. This is a hypothesis of considerable merit, but it is also unduly limited, ignoring the host of social and behavioral changes that accompany modernization and urbanization, changes that alter individual behaviors and influence physiologic adjustments. The direct result of the serious shortage of housing is that an increasing proportion of the population resorts to individual, informal provision of shelter, resulting in urban blight with the spontaneous growth of hotments and slums on public land, roadsides and quarry sites, and on land under reclamation. 11.3.1 Driving Forces of Vulnerability of Cities. Vulnerability of cities is a multidimensional problem, which requires multi-sectored planning. There are physical and socio-economic driving factors, which contribute to hazards in cities. Attempted below is a discussion on some of these aspects. A. Rapid growth and inadequate planning. As cities cannot always manage rapid population growth, poor people settle illegally in hazardous areas, less is already occupied. Basic services are lacking in local governments, as well as new settlers often have too many daily problems to worry about preventing the impending disasters. B. Population density. When people are concentrated in a limited area, a natural hazard will have a greater impact than if people were dispersed. Population density in the largest cities in developing countries is high and often higher in the old parts of the city or in squatter settlements. C. Ecological imbalance. As rapid urban development changes the local ecosystem, natural disasters can result. A shortage of appropriate drainage systems, squatter encroachments on waterways, and insufficient planning has made some cities vulnerable to flash floods. In others, deforestation has led to hillside erosion, making people vulnerable to landslide triggered by heavy rains. Overuse of groundwater resources leads to land subsidence, making the area more vulnerable to flooding or earthquakes. The use of concrete has changed the ability of soil to absorb water, leading to flash floods. D. Dependency on infrastructure and services. People in cities depend on infrastructure and public services. It is difficult for the population to meet their daily needs if the electricity is cut, bridges have collapsed, telephones do not work and water mains are broken. Essential services such as health care and firefighting are especially important after a disaster. A. Inappropriate construction. Many people die in buildings that collapse in a disaster. In earthquakes, up to 80% are killed by falling buildings. Brick buildings without a concrete frame are often dangerous in an earthquake. Wooden houses need to be strapped to their foundations so that they don't blow away in hurricane winds. Improving construction methods is usually effective in reducing casualties and can be done at low cost. F. Fire risk. The fire risk of a town depends on many factors like pattern and design of building, materials used for construction etc. It is also directly related to the nature of activities prevailing in any particular area of town. From firefighting angle, anticipated rapid industrialization will lead to manifold increase in fire risk factors because of enhanced industrial, commercial and domestic activities in urban areas are due to 1. Rapid industrialization, some of which may be dealing with hazardous materials. 2. Vertical growth of the town by constructing multi-storied buildings to accommodate More people in a limited spaces due to prohibitive cost of land in prime urban areas. 3. Rapid rate of construction of shanty settlements, which are generally made up of mud, grasses and polyethylene sheets. Prone to fire hazards. 4. Congestion due to formation of slum clusters in inaccessible distance, especially in low-lying areas of the town by the underprivileged. 5. Scarcities of essential resources like electricity, gas and specially water. 6. Poor sanitation condition and lack of well-managed sewage system. This poses great problem about urban slum and shanty settlements. Illegally these slum dwellers tap electricity and they also use various types of main power supply dependent gadgets like heater, fan, television, radio, etc. Moreover, in slum areas, water scarcity is always there. There are no built roads for the access for the wild-bodied fire tenders in such areas. Again, the thatch huts are generally constructed with highly inflammable materials like bamboo sticks, woods, tarpaulin, synthetic clothes, plastic sheets, polyester sheets etc., which during hot months of summer, catches fire very quickly with least heat. In absence of any humidity in the air, low-income urban settlements are often characterized as having limited social assets, i.e. a lack of extended family structure, established networks of contacts or strong relationships of trust. However, for many newly urbanizing groups, which rely on mutual help and support, social assets can be strong. Many livelihoods project interventions concern the building of social assets. Focusing on the threat of disaster can be a key resource in developing sustainable risk reduction measures. The slums have become a necessary evil in today's times. UNESCO, 1952, defines slums as a building, a group of buildings or area, characterized by overcrowding, deteriorated unsanitary conditions, or absence of facilities or amenities which because of these conditions or any of them endanger the health, safety or morale of its inhabitants or the community. The slums grow as a result of interaction between several complex factors, namely migration, low income, high cost of land and residence, shortage of housing, unplanned growth, illiteracy, and unbridled growth of population and most of all, uncertain living. An overcrowded slum is most prone to risks than settled areas. The aspects we are primarily concerned with the slums are, necessarily, the following. 1. As the people living in the slums are unskilled and illiterate, they do not get good jobs, resulting in a state of dependence and helplessness. In case of any risk leading to urban fire hazards and others, these people are not able to manage their living in. Hence have to depend on the government and other aids that are provided to them. 2. The degraded environment, including social, cultural, economic, political, sanitation, and health aspects, all affects the well-being of the slum people. Due to low income and other poor socio-economic conditions, such as poor sanitation, water supply, sewage amongst others, they become vulnerable to a range of risks. Living in deplorable environment also increases risks to their health in many ways, causing waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid etc. This can mean a lot of extra expenditure on medical bills. Families living in poorly built houses have severe problems during floods. During the monsoon period, the people living in the lowland slum areas cannot do their business as usual. Henceforth, their income is less during the period of 2 or 4 months. Usually these families do not have any security to compensate them for loss of income. Therefore, in one way or another, they are prone either to the natural risks or the man-made risks. 3. Disasters are frequently caused by human actions such as uncontrolled or inadequately planned human settlements, lack of basic infrastructure and the occupation of disaster-prone area. The most efficient and effective disaster preparedness systems and capabilities for post-disaster response are usually provided through volunteer contributions and local authorities' actions at the neighborhood level. 4. The action plan then addresses the vital need to decentralize decision-making if risks are to be reduced. 5. The reduction of vulnerability and augmentation of capacity to respond to disasters is directly related to the degree of decentralized access to information, communication, and decision-making and the control of resources. National and international cooperation. Networks can facilitate rapid access to specialist expertise, which can help build capacities for disaster reduction. 11.4 Issues in urban planning. From the above discussion, certain broad issues for urban planning emerge. The same are discussed as follows. I. Global warming. The impact of global warming on the international supply and demand of rice and wheat has been evaluated by Nakagawa et al. 1997 in IPCC 2001. The study has projected that the serious impacts of global warming would be felt as early as the year 2020. The gap between supply and demand may grow in some regions of Asia, resulting in considerably increased reliance on imports. Furthermore, the problem of short-term fluctuations in the market because of increased frequency of droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events will be exacerbated, making it necessary to promote measures to combat climate change on a global scale. 2. Insurance. As reported in IPCC 1996, quoted in IPCC 2001, the property insurance industry is most likely to be directly affected by climate change because it is already vulnerable to variability in extreme weather events. Dilegolecki et al. 1996. There is, however, very limited penetration of property insurance or agriculture crop insurance in many of the areas that are most affected by recent floods and cyclonic storms. Climate change can be considered a threat as well as an opportunity for the insurance industry because an increase in risks and perceived risks implies more business opportunities for the sector. Besides, climate-related stresses in coastal areas include loss and salinization of agricultural land resulting from changes in sea level, likely changes in the intensity of tropical cyclones, and the possibility of reduced productivity in coastal and oceanic fisheries. Also, clearing of mangrove areas for fishing purposes has increased the vulnerability of coastal areas to erosion. IPCC 1998. 3. Migration. In the context of these issues, in Asia, economic and population growth is expected to expand rapidly during the 21st century in many countries. The rapid increase in population will be accompanied by migration from rural communities to overcrowded large cities. Stevens, 1995, the huge energy consumption by the expanding population in urban cities would result in degradation of air and water quality, whereas rapid expansion of the economy will bring about improvements in living standards, such as improved environmental, sanitation, hygienic practice, and medical treatment facilities. Therefore, better understanding of the interaction between climate change and environmental health status in communities at regional and local scales is crucial to forge physiological acclimatization and social adaptations in the future. Public health infrastructure will have to be significantly upgraded, as incidents of heat strokes and diseases due to exposure to ultra-VB radiation are apprehended to rise with global warming. Older, economically vulnerable segments as also people with physical infirmities are at increased risk. Adverse health impacts also result from the buildup of high concentrations of air pollutants such as nitrogen dioxide, NO2, ozone, and airborne particulates in large urban areas. Combined exposures to higher temperatures and air pollutants appear to be critical risk factors for cerebral infarction and cerebral ischemia during the summer months. Peaver et al. 1999. Fresh water availability will be an acute problem, and vector-borne diseases are apprehended to be a major health problem because of climate change. IV. Infrastructure. As far as the issue of infrastructure is concerned, a comprehensive understanding of vulnerability in the current and historical perspectives would be needed to tackle it effectively. Taking into account the historical perspective to vulnerability, site selection by colonists was done primarily on economic considerations. Hence, colonial settlements were predisposed to damage by disasters such as storms, or earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions. Colonial hangover is evident in many aspects of administration in developing countries. Building codes, for instance, are mostly colonial legacies and are imported standards without much attention being paid to local factors and standards. Gavida, un. Habitat. Further, Hamza, et al. IPCC, 2001, argue that structural adjustment processes introduced by the World Bank and the IMF in the 1980s and 90s, have increased the vulnerability of cities in developing countries due to reported decreased investment in urban planning, reduced size of planning ministries or units owing to pressures to downsize the government apparatus, and political and administrative decentralization without concomitant financial decentralization or adequate resource transfer. Example in this case is Jamaica, where after the 1988 hurricane, planning and housing structures were blamed for the losses, partly because of structural adjustment policies that resulted in the poor maintenance of rental property and non-compliance with building regulations. Fred, 1987, in Bleaky, et al., 1994, v. Administrative Matters. Significant issues are involved in town planning, city administration, administration of justice, law and order, public health and hygiene, and better laws to regulate administration in the new and rising context of disaster management as integral to in development planning. Christine Wamsler discusses some of the issues in her article, Managing Urban Risk. Perceptions of housing and planning as a tool for reducing disaster risk. They are as follows. 1. International donor agencies do not stress enough on conformance of building codes in developing countries because it entails extra cost, which is foregone for other interests, as risk perception is not high as compared to developed countries. Controlling and regulating the activities of multinational corporations, particularly with regard to conformance to environmental codes and regulations and worker health and safety provisions, would be needed. 2. Construction companies work mainly for profit. Checking corruption in their operation remains a major challenge for city planners, especially in developing countries. Inadequate use of infrastructure in low-income settlements, such as inadequate waste disposal, in part from wealthy neighborhoods, the blocking of drainage systems, causing flooding, illegal electrical connections provoking fire, and inadequate water disposal causing construction instabilities are unattended problems in city administration. Chardon, 2002. In Christine Wamsler. Besides, regularizing illegal, informal settlements only serves to perpetuate these problems. In this context, the broader issue of social and economic inequality would need to be addressed, as the structure of a city's development reflects the pattern of inequality. The poor and the homeless are often housed in low-lying ground floors, which makes them vulnerable to floods, electrocution from dangling live wires during storms, etc. Vulnerability of disabled sections would also need to be a tangible policy input. Achievement of vertical and horizontal integration between the community, local, state and national levels, establishing them, missing links between large and small scale measures as well as between physical, structural, socio-political and environment measures, would be the imminent requirement in public policy formation process. Outcomes of decisions about planning, low-income housing and related socio-economic activities are not only affected by disasters but can also have a direct influence on creating new ones. With growing urbanization and even climate change, this interplay is becoming increasingly important. To illustrate with an example, the first story of a building was converted into a bakery, and supporting wall was removed for the convenience of customers. Heavy casualties were reported from that building when an earthquake struck. Hence, law, courts, and policies have to develop a disaster perspective. As per a report submitted to the BRI, inquiry, risk regulation, management and compliance, and a variety of general regulatory methods can be used to control risks. These include command and control, self-regulation, incentives, franchising, contracting or licensing, disclosure, state actions, liability laws, insurance mechanisms. Building a coalition between universities, voluntary sectors, private stakeholders and government agencies is most likely the key. An innovative concept currently in usage is the concept of defensible space. One of the main functions of cities historically was to provide defense, not protection against disasters, but against human threats from outside, and hence they were structured from the security perspective and not a disaster management perspective. Kopoma, 1999, there needs to be a change in perception as far as the idea of defense is concerned, since it is defense against hazards that needs to be incorporated into development planning, which widens the idea of defense itself, giving it a more comprehensive definition, suggesting all around protection of life and property against visitations of nature and man. Natural hazards. Natural hazards like floods, cyclones, etc. are expected now to strike with greater ferocity and also get uncertain because of climate change. Recent studies indicate that the maximum potential intensities of cyclones will possibly undergo a modest increase of as much as 10 to 20% in a warmer atmosphere. Nakagawa et al. 1998-99 warn of a possibility of increase in cyclone intensity. Coastal erosion in Asia is also apprehended to increase with sea level rise, and storm surges could still exacerbate hazards. Even if the number and intensities of tropical cyclones does not change, IPCC 1998. Hence disaster preparedness has to be mainstreamed in developmental planning with particular emphasis on construction of shelters at regular intervals, earthquake proofing and retrofitting of buildings and upgrading public health infrastructure to reduce response time in the event of disasters, and also in terms of general preparedness through our 4.1 disaster preparedness. In this context, it would be pertinent to refer to the idea of protective city planning. Coined by Newman, 1947. The idea of protective city planning suggests decentralization and isolation of vulnerable facilities from the rest of the city. The following typical ingredients indicate the broad scope of an urban risk reduction program. The starting point is urban risk assessment, which are a diagnostic process involving hazard mapping, vulnerability assessment, and resource identification and loss estimation. Training key officials through on-the-job training, mentor training workshops, and advanced academic master's degrees in programs. Development of urban and metropolitan disaster plans as part of a cross-state or national disaster plan, including the development and activation of the emergency operations centers, EOCs. Developing disaster management information system, DMIS, to provide data needs for the entire system. Protecting lifeline resources such as key infrastructure, medical resources, schools, heritage sites and police stations, communications networks, key economic assets, etc. Developing and implementing disaster mitigation measures is a demanding task in developing nations because such measures are relatively high investment inputs such as flood protection mitigation, early warning systems and programs to retrofit buildings and infrastructure. Organizing community vulnerability reduction programs, CVRP, in the most dangerous areas of the urban environment. These will need to include community preparedness measures through public education using radio, street theater, poster, newspapers, informal workshops and school curricula. The Go community has taken the lead in this area, but effective CVRPs require highly decentralized access to information and decision making. The development of viable and enforceable regulations such as land use planning in building codes. However, instead of enforcement by punishing those who do not comply, a far more effective approach would be through the use of incentives in tax holidays or reduced insurance premia, and governments need to set a good example. Therefore, all government buildings such as schools and post offices need to be structured to resist high wind impact, better fire protection, earthquake and flood proofing, etc. The development of hazard-resistant communities using partnerships between the private sector, NGOs, local institutions and the local government, Davis. 2000. To add to the understanding, the following issues were identified that need to be addressed by the government in order to reduce vulnerability and risk and improve safety of urban and rural habitats in a seminar in May 2001. The following thrust areas were identified to evolve a concrete plan of action. All new building constructions should have mandatory provisions for disaster mitigation and disaster-resistant features for safety against earthquakes and cyclones. To assess the hazard safety of existing buildings and to demonstrate and encourage owners for retrofitting, strengthening methods of unsafe buildings, particularly those where safety of large number of people is involved. To ensure that only qualified, licensed and/or accredited professionals, architects, engineers, contractors, builders, developers, are engaged for planning, designing and constructing buildings and infrastructure through improved regulatory mechanisms, and also to provide legal, unauthorized constructions in all urban sectors, to ensure the highest level of professional participation with technologists, scientists, engineers, architects, geologists and seismologists, on all facets of human settlement, development and creation of safe habitats against all natural and man-made disasters such as earthquake, cyclones, floods, landslides, fire, etc. Instrumentation for early warning against cyclones needs upgradation and modernization for all its phases, namely pre-cyclone watch, cyclone alert, and cyclone warning and post-landfall outlook. The present initiative of the Department of Science, creating an appropriate network S-band radar, should be converted into a time-bound national program with assured funding, telemetric instrumentation, and early warning against earthquake-induced landslides, which have been a very serious cause of concern virtually with every earthquake in our entire Himalayan belt, deserve to be encouraged, and modern early warning systems should be installed on all hot spots, especially in strategic locations. Considering the large-scale geoclimatological variations in different parts of the country, with hilly terrains, midlands and coastal areas, the development and dissemination of region-specific guidelines and user-friendly brochures on application of disaster-resistant technologies should be prepared and made applicable to each of the regions. Supporting activities. Supporting activities would be required by various organizations which will be called upon to perform their functions expeditiously and efficiently, such as hazard monitoring. Organizations are remote sensing, geographic information systems, Bureau of Indian Standards and the like. Large-scale community awareness programs, especially targeting the student community, should be launched, keeping in view the emergent need for adopting a holistic approach for disaster management at the state level. The seminar recommends that all the state governments should formulate and implement state-level disaster management plans for mitigation and reduction of vulnerability for natural calamities existing in each state. 11.5 Initiatives for risk reduction in India. Significant for urban risk reduction have been initiated. For example, the state government of Maharashtra, with the support of the World Bank, the Department of International Development (DFID), and the UNDP, has embarked on one of the most promising disaster-centered plans in the world, with Mumbai fully integrated into the project. This plan includes the establishment of state-wide emergency management centers, development of disaster plans for all districts, community vulnerability risk reduction, and the training of officials at all levels at the government training centers for the Indian Administrative Service, and the setting up of a disaster management information system, DMIS. The RADIUS project was initiated with 1996 with the aim of identifying key cities at risk from earthquakes throughout Asia and supporting seismic risk reduction programs. This initiative is being administered by the IGNOU Secretariat, and progress was scheduled to be reported at the closing conference of the IGNOU in July 1999 in Geneva. The Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, ADPC, has promoted the Asian Urban Disaster Mitigation Program, AUDMP, with multi-hazard pilot projects being developed throughout the Asian countries. In India, the focus has been on technological and industrial hazards, with projects in Baroda and in metropolitan Calcutta. USAID initiatives. The USAID has identified the following areas for support activity to the Government of India. 1. Facilitated and expedited reconstruction and rehabilitation in accordance with sound and equitable standards. 2. It is critical to re-establish normalcy and livelihoods in affected communities as soon as possible following a disaster. It is equally important to re-establish security and restore the functioning of basic institutions to meet critical needs and basic rights. Depending on resource availability and specific rehabilitation requirements, USAID will provide support to help rebuild social and physical infrastructure. This IR will support efforts to examine policies that affect the rehabilitation phase, e.g., those governing banking and insurance, and engage the GOI in increasing responsiveness to an equity for the needs of those most affected. Illustrative activities. Retrofitting of public buildings, for example, schools, to be more earthquake Resistant. Support for materials stockpiling for reconstruction inputs. Microfinance support for affected small-scale enterprises or the informal sector. Training programs for engineers and masons on how to build more disaster-resistant structures, and information system support to promote transparency and equity in GOI and private sector disaster response. 3. Increased community preparedness to mitigate and manage disasters. Mitigation activities lead to long-term risk reduction, reduced loss of life and property, and more effective and less expensive response and rehabilitation. Illustrative activities. Community-level disaster planning. Drought mitigation. Public awareness and information campaigns. First responder training. Hospital preparedness. Exposure to best practices opportunities in country, regional, and international. Building code enforcement. Weather and flood forecasting, and instituting early warning systems. 11.6 Conclusion. Vulnerability is a function of variability and distribution in physical and socio-economic systems, the limited human ability to cope with additional and sometimes accumulating hazard and the social and economic constraints that limit these abilities. The mitigation measures for the improvement and upgradation of the slums are as follows. 1. The government should allot more funds to the slums and should take interest in the clearing and rebuilding of the slums. 2. The government should not allow growth of new slums in the city. 3. Land ownership should be given to those who occupied the government lands long ago, and land grabbers must be discouraged by punishment. 4. The government should take into the consideration the living conditions in slums and it should work efficiently and effectively to improve them. 5. Public lavatories with water supply should be provided for those slums which lack this facility to improve the sanitation and health conditions. 6. Since the slum environment is one congestive, remedial action must be taken by the government to decongest it. 7. Every slum should be provided with the basic infrastructure facilities. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.